Mucizeler için doğa kanunlarının ihlali tanımı doğru mudur? Mucizelere tanık olmak Allah'ın varlığına delil olabilir mi?
Thank you. Now, are miracles violations of laws of nature? Well, in the Christian world, that's not how some of the classical theologians have seen it. St. Augustine, for example, in 400 in the Common Era, round about then, said that when such things as Aaron's rod turn to a serpent, that's an event described in the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament, when his rod turns into a serpent, that looks like it's against nature to us. But our knowledge of nature is limited. It's not against nature for God. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of our most gifted philosophers and theologians in the whole history of the church, made a similar comment that miracles are not against nature. St. Thomas made a very interesting distinction, that between God as the primary cause of the universe's existence and God as endowing the universe with secondary causes, with causal powers of its own. But he does go on to say that doesn't limit what God can do. God can produce effects without the cause. God can do anything he pleases. But he doesn't describe that as against nature either, like Augustine doesn't. It's when we come to the 18th century and the famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume that we get the definition of miracles as violations of laws of nature. Hume wrote an essay with the title Of Miracles, and he was arguing against us, really against us believing them. Interestingly enough, I was in Edinburgh a few years ago, and I have a photograph of myself beside a huge monument to David Hume. But a few streets away, there's a monument to James Clerk Maxwell, who you will have heard of, also very famous, but very famous as a scientist. But actually, Maxwell was a believer, a Christian believer, and believed in miracles. So certainly he would not have seen a conflict between his science and miracles. Now, in this essay of miracles, Hume says a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle is as strong as any proof can be. Right. Now, you'll probably also have heard of C.S. Lewis, whose scholarly work was in medieval literature, but he was famous as a Christian apologist. He wrote a book of miracles, famous also for the Narnia stories, which were written for children, but equally readable, I think, and beneficial to read as an adult. C.S. Lewis took Hume to task. He said, well, of course, we must agree with Hume if there's absolutely uniform experience against miracles. If, in other words, they haven't happened, well, then they haven't. But then we only know the experience against them to be uniform if we know that all the reports of them, which are many, are false. And we can only know they're false if we know that miracles have never occurred. So it's a circular argument. In another place in Of Miracles, Hume puts it rather differently. He says that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony is such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Now, hard to get your head around that, but we can put that in modern day terms, in probabilistic terms. We can say, to establish a miracle, the probability that the miracle, there's testimony to the miracle, given that it didn't occur, is absolutely tiny, less than the probability of the miracle itself before we even look at any testimony. that's how we can interpret the testimony being miraculous, if you like. The problem with that, though, is that testimony accumulates. A single testimony might be like that, but testimony can mount up and indeed can overcome any prior probability for the miracle. The more and more testimony we gather to a miracle, supposed miracle. I'm actually a priest in the Church of England, and in a previous parish, I once preached a sermon about miracles in which I asked my congregation whether they believe that eggs bounce. I'm telling you, eggs bounce. How many of you believe that? Well, 1 or 2 hands went up, but the vast majority of hands stayed down. Right? I then asked a young boy, George, when I came round to your house the other day, we went into your garden and we threw eggs into the air, what happened? He said, they bounce. So I then asked the congregation, well, do you believe that eggs bounce now? Well, a few more hands went up. I then asked a young girl in the congregation, Sophie, what happened when I came round to your house? We went into the garden and we threw eggs. She said, they bounce. Now, virtually all the hands went up. I'd got them all, pretty much all, to believe it. And indeed, eggs do bounce. That was perfectly true. When I moved to my next parish, I couldn't quite get that to work, whether the ground was very hard or whatever. It perhaps takes certain conditions. But that particular spring, perhaps the ground was off, and it all worked. So, but that's an illustration of how testimony can mount up. Now, does testimony to miracles provide evidence for the existence of God? Well, given that miracles are much more likely to occur if there is a God, then yes, miracles can be part of an argument for the existence of God. Now, I've come to think, though, that may not be the best strategy, particularly in the light of doing ramified natural theology. It might be that your starting point for your probability of there being a miracle a priori is very low, as Hume suggests. The testimony can mount up, but it may not be a strong argument. However, if you have established to a high degree of probability from other arguments, and I think some of the ones I discussed at the beginning are very powerful. The one I've concentrated on, particularly the fine-tuning argument, also certainly at the present time on our present understanding of the universe, the Kalam argument looks strong. But there are others from possessing rationality and there being objective moral values and so on, and that we can latch on to these from religious experience. In fact, that people experience the presence of God. Well, there are lots and lots of arguments whereby we can get a good handle on there being a God behind it all, and work that up into a high probability. Then we're starting in a better position when we look at the details of what we believe, and in my case, as a Christian, the details of the life and the death, and as we also believe, resurrection of Jesus Christ. So because the probability that God would act, given that there is a God, the probability that he would perform a miracle, of course, is much higher than if there were no God. That's true. And then that enables us to take into account the testimony, and the testimony then can make it overwhelmingly, very highly likely that the things we're trying to establish actually happened. So that is a brief run through of what I think about miracles, which is, I think again and again, as I said before, there's no substitute for detailed historical examination of the claims to miracle. David Hume looks at whether Queen Elizabeth I was resurrected or something like that. Completely, no reason why we should believe that whatsoever. He has an interesting example, though, of a prince, and I think John Locke also has this example of an Indian prince who's told that water can freeze over, and there can be something called ice, and he has very great difficulty believing that. You see, it would be difficult to believe things that are perfectly valid scientifically if one had no experience, and then the scientific laws get changed. So that's just another little bit to add on. But that's really, I think, probably all I have to say about miracles. I think the testimony can build up. It can make the miracle highly credible, particularly if you already have a prior belief in God. Okay.
The last thing you say, I think it's like Bose-Einstein condensation. When you put helium isotopes together,
yes,
one of the isotopes is like flowing upward.
Oh yes.
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
Yes, yes.
Yet it's scientific.
Yes, exactly. I think science certainly throws us up with surprises, doesn't it? And of course, people have been surprised at the time of the sort of major revolutions that we've had in science. When relativity came along, when quantum theory came along, highly surprising things which just didn't fit the way we understood nature before these theories came along. So I think that's an important thing. If you rule, I think it's very hard to distinguish ruling out miracles from saying, well, this particular scientific theory is fixed for all time. It's never going to be corrected. We're never going to find a counterexample. There may be circumstances in which there are counterexamples.